It all started with my cousin Brad's bright idea. You know what would make this barbecue even better? He asked, holding up a box the size of a small refrigerator. What? Aunt Carol asked skeptically. An inflatable pool, Brad said, grinning like he'd just solved world peace. Now, our backyard wasn't exactly spacious, but Brad insisted that this pool would fit perfectly. It's called the Mega Splash Deluxe, he said proudly, showing off the picture on the box. Holds up to 2,000 gallons of water. Aunt Carol squinted at the picture. Brad, that pool is the size of my living room. Relax, Brad replied, brushing her off. We'll just put it in the middle of the yard. What could go wrong? By the time the box was unpacked, it was clear that Mega Splash Deluxe was an understatement. The pool unfolded like a parachute, covering nearly half the yard. Brad and a few of the kids wrestled with it for a good 10 minutes, trying to line it up just right. This thing is huge, my cousin Lauren said, stepping over the edge of the vinyl monstrosity. Big fun requires big plans, Brad replied, patting the side of the pool. Nobody questioned how they were going to fill it, because Brad had already thought of that. He pointed to the garden hose with a triumphant grin. We'll just let it fill up while we eat. By the time we're done with burgers, it'll be ready to go. Aunt Carol frowned. Are you sure the ground can handle that much water? Brad waved her off. Of course. This yard's solid. Famous last words. The hose was turned on, and the water started flowing. At first, it seemed harmless, a slow, steady stream filling the bottom of the pool. Brad leaned back in his chair, looking extremely pleased with himself. See, he said, gesturing at the pool. Piece of cake. But as the pool began to fill, its sides started to bulge ominously. The vinyl creaked under the weight of the water, and a few of us exchanged nervous glances. Brad? Lauren said, pointing at the bulging side. Is it supposed to look like that? Totally normal, Brad replied, waving her off. Spoiler, it was not normal. As the pool continued to fill, the atmosphere shifted from excitement to mild concern. The sides of the pool, which had been perfectly straight just an hour ago, were now bowing outward like a balloon ready to burst. Brad, are you sure this is okay? Aunt Carol asked, her hands on her hips. Totally fine, Brad said, though his eyes were glued to the pool. This is just physics. Physics? Lauren asked, raising an eyebrow. It looks more like a disaster waiting to happen. Brad waved her off again, but this time his confidence seemed a little shaky. By the time the burgers were done, the pool was almost full. The water level was just a few inches from the top, and the bulging sides were creaking louder than ever. A small crowd had gathered to watch, including the neighbors, who leaned over the fence with expressions that ranged from amused to deeply concerned. You know, Mr. Turner, the neighbor said, I'm pretty sure those pools aren't meant to hold that much water. Brad rolled his eyes. It's called the Mega Splash Deluxe for a reason, Mr. Turner. Okay, Mr. Turner said, shrugging. But if it bursts, don't say I didn't warn you. Just then, someone screamed. We turned to see Brad's golden retriever, Rusty, sprinting toward the pool with a tennis ball in his mouth. Rusty, no! Brad yelled, but it was too late. Rusty leaped over the side of the pool, his paws landing squarely on the bulging vinyl. The impact was all it took. With a loud pop and a sound that could only be described as a tidal wave, the pool gave way. Water erupted from the pool, rushing across the yard like a miniature tsunami. Chairs were knocked over. Picnic blankets were soaked, and a cooler full of soda cans floated away like tiny boats. Rusty, unfazed, paddled happily in the flood before hopping out and shaking water all over Aunt Carol. My flowers, Aunt Carol shrieked, pointing at her carefully tended garden, which was now a muddy swamp. The grill, Lauren shouted as the wave reached the barbecue, extinguishing the flames with a dramatic hiss. And then we heard it, a bark from the other side of the fence. We all turned toward the fence to see the source of the barking. Rusty's splash tsunami had surged into the neighbor's yard, soaking everything in its path, including Mrs. Turner's overly pampered Yorkie Muffin. Muffin stood frozen in a puddle, her fur dripping wet and her tiny bow drooping over one ear. She let out a high-pitched yelp, clearly scandalized by the indignity of it all. Mrs. Turner, clutching a towel, gasped as she surveyed the damage. "Bradley!" she shrieked, her voice piercing enough to stop the golden retriever mid-shake. "What have you done to Muffin?" Brad, standing ankle-deep in water, raised his hands in surrender. "It was an accident, Mrs. Turner. I swear." Meanwhile, the wave of water had spread far and wide. The kiddie pool, which had been untouched in the corner of the yard, was now floating upside down in the middle of the driveway. Picnic plates and plastic cups bobbed along the makeshift river, and Lauren was frantically chasing a runaway watermelon that had escaped from the table. "Somebody help me," she yelled as the watermelon rolled toward the street. Rusty, thinking this was some kind of game, darted after her, barking excitedly. "Rusty, no!" Brad shouted, slipping in the mud as he tried to grab the dog. The watermelon finally came to a stop when it hit the tire of Aunt Carol's car, splattering open on impact. Rusty, ever the optimist, sniffed the mess and wagged his tail, clearly pleased with his contribution. As chaos unfolded, Aunt Carol stood in the middle of the yard, her shoes soaked and her arms crossed. "I told you this was a bad idea, Bradley," she yelled over the commotion. Brad, now covered in mud, held up the limp remains of the pool's vinyl wall. "It's not my fault," he insisted. Rusty jumped in. "You're the one who set this up." Aunt Carol snapped, gesturing at the flooded yard. Lauren, still out of breath from chasing the watermelon, chimed in. "You should have listened to Mr. Turner. He literally called this." By now, the neighbors were fully invested in the spectacle. Mr. Turner, holding a lawn chair, shouted over the fence, "This is better than TV. You should charge tickets next time, Brad." Mrs. Turner, still clutching Muffin, was less amused. "You'll be paying for this, Bradley. Muffin needs a proper grooming after this ordeal." Brad groaned, wiping water and mud off his face. "This is why I don't do pools." "Clearly," Aunt Carol muttered, as the water slowly receded. The aftermath of the Mega Splash Deluxe disaster came into full view. The backyard looked like a war zone. Lawn chairs were overturned. Soggy paper plates were plastered to the grass, and Aunt Carol's flower bed now resembled a muddy crater. Rusty, blissfully unaware of the chaos he had caused, pranced around the yard, tail wagging, proudly carrying a piece of the deflated pool in his mouth. "Rusty, drop it!" Brad yelled, lunging for the dog. Rusty, naturally, took this as an invitation to play tug-of-war, growling playfully and pulling the vinyl even harder. Aunt Carol stormed over, hands on her hips. "Brad, get that dog under control before he eats the entire pool." "I'm trying," Brad said, slipping in the mud and landing flat on his back. Meanwhile, Lauren had started gathering the scattered remains of the barbecue. She held up a soggy burger bun and sighed. "Well, so much for lunch." Mr. Turner, still laughing from his front row seat at the fence, called out, "Hey, Brad, I think you missed a spot." He pointed to a plastic plate that had floated into the corner of the yard, now stuck in the mud like a sad shipwreck. "I'll get it later," Brad muttered, still wrestling with Rusty for control of the pool remains. Later, Aunt Carol snapped, "Bradley, you're cleaning this up now." As Brad finally managed to wrest the vinyl from Rusty's mouth, Muffin let out another high-pitched bark from the neighbor's porch. The tiny Yorkie, now wrapped in a towel, glared at Brad like he had personally ruined her day. Mrs. Turner appeared behind her, shaking her head. "I hope you have insurance, Bradley," she said, wagging her finger. This was a catastrophe. Brad, covered in mud and holding a torn piece of pool vinyl, muttered, "I'll pay for the grooming, Mrs. Turner." "I swear." "You better," she huffed before disappearing back into her house. The yard cleanup began in earnest, with everyone pitching in, some more willingly than others. Lauren carried the remains of the kiddie pool to the trash, muttering under her breath about never trusting Brad's ideas again. Rusty, still full of energy, darted around the yard chasing muddy tennis balls. "Rusty's having the time of his life," Mr. Turner commented with a chuckle. "Well, at least someone is," Aunt Carol replied, glaring at Brad as he dragged the deflated pool toward the garage. Just as things seemed to be winding down, a new disaster struck. The water from the burst pool had flowed down the driveway, pooling around the storm drain, and with it went all the little bits of debris from the barbecue. "What's that smell?" Lauren asked, wrinkling her nose. Brad froze. I think the water carried some of the grease from the grill." Aunt Carol's eyes widened. "You're telling me the storm drain is clogged with grease and burger scraps?" "Well, when you say it like that," Brad began, but Carol cut him off. "Bradley." As the greasy water continued to pool around the storm drain, Aunt Carol entered full panic mode. "We can't leave it like this," she exclaimed, waving her arms. "The whole neighborhood will smell like barbecue grease for weeks." Brad, still holding the limp remains of the pool, scratched his head. "It's just water. It'll drain eventually, right?" "No, it won't," Carol barked, grabbing a rake from the shed. "We need to clear the drain before the Turners call the HOA. Or worse, the city." Lauren, always the practical one, stepped forward. "All right, let's just scoop the debris out. It can't be that hard." She crouched by the storm drain and started pulling out soggy napkins, pieces of burger buns, and what looked like half a watermelon rind. "Ew," she muttered, holding up the rind like it was a dead fish. Rusty, still full of energy, ran over and snatched the rind out of her hand, darting off down the street with his prize. "Rusty!" Brad yelled, chasing after him. Meanwhile, Aunt Carol directed the rest of us, like a general leading troops into battle. "Lauren, keep clearing the drain. Tim, grab a bucket. And someone get the hose to rinse this mess down." Mr. Turner, still watching from his fence, offered his own advice. "Try some dish soap. It cuts grease." "Thanks, Turner," Carol muttered through gritted teeth. "We'll keep that in mind as we work to clear the drain." The situation only got messier. The hose sent greasy water spraying everywhere, soaking our shoes and leaving a faint smell of charred burgers in the air. Lauren slipped and landed on her knees, her hands covered in soggy napkins. "This is disgusting," she groaned. "It's character building," Aunt Carol replied without missing a beat. By the time Brad returned with Rusty and a very chewed-up watermelon rind, the drain was finally starting to clear. A satisfying gurgle echoed through the yard as the water began to flow again. "See," Brad said, grinning triumphantly. "Crisis averted." Carol glared at him. "The only crisis that's averted is the one where I don't strangle you." The yard, however, was still a disaster. Soggy lawn chairs, muddy footprints, and the remnants of the pool were scattered everywhere. Mr. Turner clapped from his fence, a wide grin on his face. "Best entertainment I've had in years," he called out. "Glad we could help," Brad replied, though his grin faded when Carol shot him a warning look. With the storm drain finally cleared, Aunt Carol stood in the middle of the soggy, muddy yard, hands on her hips, surveying the damage. The once pristine barbecue setup now looked like it had been hit by a hurricane. "All right," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Who wants dessert?" Brad, still holding a soggy corner of the deflated pool, perked up. "Pie?" he asked hopefully. "Pie?" Carol snapped, spinning around to glare at him. "Bradley, the yard is a swamp, the Turners hate us, and my flowers are ruined. Do you think I'm worried about pie?" Brad shrugged sheepishly. "Well, a little pie might help lighten the mood." Lauren, trying to break the tension, chimed in. "Maybe we should focus on getting the yard back in order first. Dessert can wait." Rusty, as if sensing the opportunity for more chaos, barked excitedly and darted toward the toppled kiddie pool. He grabbed the edge with his teeth and began dragging it through the mud. "Rusty, no!" Brad shouted, chasing after him for the second time that day. The golden retriever ignored him, pulling the pool in circles like it was the greatest toy ever invented. Mud sprayed everywhere, adding a fresh layer of filth to an already disastrous scene. Meanwhile, Mr. Turner leaned over the fence, his phone still recording. "This just keeps getting better," he said with a chuckle. "You should post this online, Brad. You'd go viral." "I'm good, thanks," Brad muttered, finally managing to wrestle the kiddie pool away from Rusty. Mrs. Turner appeared beside her husband, holding Muffin, who now looked even fluffier than before after her emergency blow-dry. "Bradley," she called out sharply, "when can I expect payment for Muffin's grooming?" "As soon as I get paid," Brad replied, earning himself another glare from Aunt Carol. As the cleanup dragged on, the neighbors began to lose interest. Mr. Turner packed up his lawn chair, calling out, "See you next weekend for round 2. "Don't encourage him," Aunt Carol shouted, throwing her hands in the air. With the Turners finally gone, the family got back to work. Lauren picked up scattered napkins, Brad hosed off the grill, and Aunt Carol attempted to salvage what was left of her flower bed. "Hey, at least the yard is well watered now," Brad said with a nervous chuckle. Carol shot him a look that could freeze water. By sunset, the backyard was somewhat back to normal. The pool was folded up, well, more like crumpled into a pile. The grill was cleaned and most of the debris had been cleared. But the yard itself, muddy, patchy, and strewn with torn grass, was beyond repair. As we gathered on the porch, exhausted and filthy, Aunt Carol finally spoke. "Bradley," she said slowly, "if you ever bring another inflatable pool into this house, I will personally deflate it." "With a knife?" "Understood," Brad replied, nodding solemnly. Rusty, still wagging his tail, plopped down at Brad's feet, clearly proud of his day's work. By the time Aunt Carol had finished issuing her "no more inflatable pools" decree, the rest of us were too exhausted to argue. We sat on the porch, watching the last rays of sunlight glint off the muddy puddles that used to be the backyard. Lauren broke the silence. "You know, technically, this is Brad's fault, but Rusty definitely deserves some of the blame." Rusty, lying on his side and panting contentedly, wagged his tail at the mention of his name. "Oh, no," Brad said, raising a finger. "Rusty was just being a dog. The real villain here is the pool manufacturer. That thing wasn't sturdy at all." Aunt Carol glared at him. "The pool manufacturer didn't tell you to fill it with 2,000 gallons of water." "Bradley." "Details," Brad muttered, sinking deeper into his chair. As the conversation fizzled out, we all tried to pretend we weren't still ankle-deep in chaos. The grill had been saved, but the burgers were soggy. The flowers were trampled. The storm drain still smelled faintly of grease, and Mrs. Turner's Yorkie was probably plotting revenge. Lauren, always the realist, looked at Aunt Carol. "So, are we still doing dessert?" "Dessert?" Carol repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Sure. Let me wade through the swamp to find it." "Technically," Brad chimed in, "it's more of a marsh than a swamp." "Bradley," Carol said through clenched teeth, "I'm this close to throwing you in that marsh." Just as we were starting to regain some semblance of calm, Rusty jumped up, ears perked. Before anyone could react, he darted off the porch, barking wildly at something near the fence. "What now?" Lauren groaned, dragging herself to her feet. Rusty had found a new treasure, the soggy remains of the watermelon rind he'd stolen earlier. He proudly carried it back to the porch, dropping it at Aunt Carol's feet like a gift. "Lovely," Carol said, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Just what I needed." Brad smirked. "See? He's just trying to help." Carol turned to him, her patience hanging by a thread. "You know what would really help? If you and your dog clean this mess up, every last bit of it." And so, with the light fading and the mud drying into an unholy paste, Brad and Rusty got to work. Well, Brad worked. Rusty mostly ran in circles, barking at imaginary threats and occasionally sitting down in the mud for a break. Lauren and I supervised from the porch, trying not to laugh as Brad struggled to wrangle the chaos he had unleashed. I'll admit, Lauren said, biting back a grin, this barbecue was more memorable than most. Memorable? I replied, this is going down in family history. By the time Brad and Rusty were halfway through their cleanup effort, the yard looked like something out of a survival movie. Piles of muddy debris were scattered everywhere. The grass was shredded, and Rusty had managed to coat himself in a new layer of muck. Rusty, you're not helping. Brad groaned as the golden retriever proudly dragged a muddy garden gnome across the yard. Aunt Carol appeared on the porch, her hands firmly on her hips. Bradley, what is that dog doing now? Just adding to the decor, Brad muttered, snatching the gnome from Rusty's mouth. Meanwhile, Lauren was trying to salvage what was left of the barbecue food. She held up a soggy burger bun and sighed. This is beyond saving. I think we're officially out of food. I told you we should have just ordered pizza, I said, leaning against the railing. Pizza, Brad shouted, perking up. That's a great idea. Aunt Carol raised an eyebrow. Oh no, you're not getting out of this that easily. You'll finish cleaning the yard first, Brad groaned, dragging the garden hose back toward the muddy mess. Fine, but I'm not tipping the pizza guy after this. As the cleanup continued, Rusty found his way to the Turner's yard again. This time, he had his sights set on Muffin, the freshly groomed Yorkie who was sunbathing on the porch. Rusty, no, Brad yelled, sprinting toward the fence. But Rusty had already hopped over the barrier like a canine athlete. He bolted straight for Muffin, who let out a series of panicked yelps and darted into the house. Mrs. Turner appeared at the door, clutching a broom like a weapon. Bradley, she shrieked, get your dog out of my yard. I'm trying. Brad called back, scrambling over the fence. The rest of us watched from a safe distance as Brad chased Rusty through the Turners' pristine garden, trampling their carefully arranged flower beds in the process. This just keeps getting better, Lauren said, laughing as she pulled out her phone to record. By the time Brad returned with Rusty in tow, Mrs. Turner was yelling about calling the HOA again. Aunt Carol was waiting for him on the porch, her arms crossed. Do I even want to know what happened over there? She asked. Brad shook his head. Probably not. Rusty, completely unbothered, flopped down in the mud with a satisfied sigh. With the sun setting and Rusty finally settled down, the yard was beginning to resemble something manageable, if you squinted and ignored the muddy patches and torn-up flower beds. Brad, exhausted but determined, gave the garden hose one last flick to rinse off the remaining mess. All right, he said, dropping the hose dramatically. I think we're officially done. Aunt Carol stepped off the porch, surveying the yard with her signature critical eye. Done? Bradley. It looks like a herd of elephants ran through here. Brad shrugged. Technically, it was just one very enthusiastic golden retriever. Lauren snorted, trying not to laugh. And a very careless human. As we began to gather the last of the debris, Mr. Turner reappeared at the fence, holding up his phone. Hey, Brad, just so you know, the video of Rusty chasing Muffin is already blowing up on social media. What? Brad exclaimed, his jaw dropping. Yeah, Mr. Turner said with a smirk. Captioned it, The Great Backyard Flood and the Muddy Dog Show. You're at 10,000 views and climbing. Great, Aunt Carol muttered. Now the whole internet knows about this disaster. Brad, surprisingly, didn't seem too upset. Maybe we can spin this into something positive, he said, perking up. Like family barbecue adventures. We could go viral. Lauren groaned. Brad, nobody wants to see a backyard destruction channel. Speak for yourself, Brad replied, grinning. Rusty's a star. Rusty, hearing his name, barked and wagged his tail, sending another spray of mud in every direction. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Aunt Carol finally relented. All right, fine. Let's order pizza. But Bradley, you're paying for it, and for my flowers. Deal, Brad said quickly, pulling out his phone. Make it a large, Lauren added. I think we've earned it. By the time the pizza arrived, the family had settled on the porch, laughing about the day's chaos. Rusty, still muddy but happy, sat proudly at Brad's feet, clearly convinced he had been the hero of the day. You know, Lauren said between bites of pizza, this might have been the most eventful barbecue we've ever had. Agreed, I added. But next time, let's skip the inflatable pool. Brad smirked. Come on. What could go wrong with a bouncy castle? Don't even think about it, Bradley, Aunt Carol warned, pointing a slice of pizza at him. By the time the pizza boxes were empty, the chaos of the day had turned into a shared family joke. Aunt Carol sat back in her chair, sipping a lemonade, while the rest of us recounted the day's disasters in between fits of laughter. Remember when Rusty jumped into the pool? Lauren said, wiping tears from her eyes. And then turned the backyard into a slip-and-slide, I added. And let's not forget Muffin's dramatic escape, Brad chimed in, grinning. That little dog has some serious speed. Carol, however, wasn't laughing. She leaned forward, fixing Brad with a sharp glare. This isn't funny, Bradley. My flowers are ruined. The yard is a swamp, and the Turners probably hate us now. Brad held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. No more inflatable pools. I promise. Just as we were about to call it a night, Mr. Turner reappeared at the fence with a wide grin. Hey, Brad, he called out. The video just hit 100,000 views. Brad's jaw dropped. You're kidding? Nope, Mr. Turner replied, holding up his phone. The comments are wild. People love Rusty. Rusty, hearing his name again, barked happily and wagged his tail, splattering what little clean space was left on the porch with mud. Carol groaned. Great. Now the whole world knows about this mess. Look on the bright side, Brad said, his grin returning. We're famous. Rusty could be the next internet star. Carol shook her head. If Rusty's the star, then you're the disaster director. Despite her grumbling, even Carol couldn't deny that the day had brought the family closer together. As the last bits of sunlight disappeared, she let out a sigh and turned to Brad. Next time, maybe stick to something simple, like a picnic. Sure, Brad replied with a smirk. Simple, maybe with some sparklers, and a bouncy castle. Bradley, Carol snapped, but her stern expression softened into a smile. As we packed up the last of the mess and said our goodbyes, one thing was certain. This barbecue would go down in family history. Rusty, now fast asleep on the porch, had clearly had the time of his life. And Brad? Well, Brad was already planning the next adventure. What's the most chaotic family gathering you've ever been a part of? Would you let Brad and Rusty plan another event? Or is it time to keep things simple? Let me know in the comments.